Good morning here in New York and across the East Coast of the United States down to DC, and konbanwa to all those joining from Tokyo. I'm Joshua Walker here at Japan Society. I'm excited about not just our topic today. It's something that we've all been thinking about over the last 40 days of the Biden administration, U.S. Japan relations and what comes next. But particularly for our panelists today, we're going to be looking at the Biden administration, its priorities, U.S. foreign policy more broadly, and specifically how it will impact Japan, and thinking about its implications for the U.S. Japan economic and security relations from here and beyond. Of course, there's lots to talk about. I can't wait to dive in. But before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to say thank you to our business and policy sponsors, our global leaders, Citi and Deloitte, and our corporate partners, Mizuho Financial Group and Toyota Motors of North America. But a big special thanks to our friends of the National Association of Japan American Societies and Peter Kelly and his team for their generous support of this program. And it's great to see so many of our Japan America friends joining us today. To all of you from that space, our speakers today are no strangers. You know them. They're the people we get to hear from. They're the people I always turn to for information and to learn the latest. Let me go very quickly through the list, and then let me jump right in to the meat of today's conversation. Let me start in alphabetical order with last names with Toshihiro Nakayama sensei. He's a professor of American politics and foreign policy at the Faculty of Politics and Management at Keio University. You've probably seen him all over the news, specifically during the election time. He's the most turned to news commentator. Toshi sensei, thank you so much for joining us today. Next, we have Miria Solis down in Washington, D.C., who's the director and center for the East Asian Policy Studies. She's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Center. She's specifically focused on Japan as the Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies at Brookings Institution. You know her as one of the top experts in Washington on Japan and also on trade policy, so there's going to be a lot to discuss. Thank you, Miria-san, for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, we have Dimitri, who is the U.S. China correspondent at the Financial Times and is the self-described happiest man in Washington, having been covering the White House over the last 5.5 years and having lived in Tokyo, among many other impressive areas he's been. So Dimitri, we're looking forward to talking to you about the broader geopolitics. Let's just start with an assessment of each of you all, and thank you for joining us. Miria-san, there in Washington, it's been over 40 days since the Biden administration came to town. What's your assessment? How are things going more broadly in terms of both there in Washington, but U.S.-Japan relations that you focus on?
Thank you, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here with you and everyone else in the panel. I'm looking forward very much to this conversation. And the view from Washington, it's almost like the view from Bethesda, right? I mean, we're still very much confined, but I can say that it is quite a different, the atmospherics are very different. I think that I would describe this as a period of more calm, hopefully the return of quiet competence. We're not watching constantly for that tweet that may shake things up. I think that what the Biden administration is trying to do is to retire the chaos theory of having leverage of international affairs by constantly, with a zigzag, if you will, approach to issues. And I think that there's been a return of the interagency process, a desire for consistency, a more familiar face to American diplomacy. Quite frankly, it is hard to say with confidence and with nuance what is going to be the direction of this administration, because we're still in the midst of the confirmation process. So the cabinet members and others are still being put in place. But also because one item that has been noticeable is that this administration is launching reviews, policy reviews across the board, be that on China policy, on supply chain resilience, industrial base, trade policy. So we have to wait still a little bit. We still have to see a fleshing out of what does it mean for America to be back in international affairs. I think it's only been 40 days, but progress has been made in controlling the pandemic with the vaccine distribution. That is central, because without that, we're going to be hampered in any other endeavors. There is, of course, a possibility of a very large stimulus package making its way through Congress. That would give us an opportunity to be much more forthcoming addressing the pandemic and addressing some of our competitiveness gaps. And just to round up this initial set of remarks, even though we're very homebound and travel is very difficult, I think that there's been already a re-energizing of American diplomacy in some very important ways. The return to multilateralism is very palpable. with the rejoining of the Paris Agreement, re-engagement with the World Health Organization, ending the stalemate for the WTO's Director General to be appointed. Those are very important steps. And then meetings, virtual meetings with foreign leaders, and the one between Prime Minister Suga and President Biden, I think, was very productive. I think that they covered all the fundamentals. There were reassurances on Article 5 covering the Senkaku Islands as territory administered by Japan, reinforcement of the notion that the free and open Indo-Pacific is central to this administration's Asia policy. But if I've been saying this, Josh, and I'll say it again, it's calm waters, but it's still not clear where the US and Japan can act proactively in terms of geoeconomics, in terms of economic statecraft. We're just seeing that foundation being built, and the US still a bit hampered in coming with a more proactive theory of what the US can do with a positive statement of US leadership. But we can talk about the details later on.
We'll definitely be coming back to that. I think this idea of calm waters and there being something under the surface, I want to return to that. So speaking of calm waters, let me just go to Dimitri there in Washington as well to talk about the bigger picture here. You focus on U.S. China. That seems to be one area that we don't see much calm waters. There's been a lot of heated exchange, whether it's in the waters around the islands of Japan or what's going to happen in Taiwan. How do you assess so far the Biden administration, looking at it from the current beat you have, looking at this from the broader geopolitical point of view?
Well, I think, and good morning and everyone, and good evening, everyone in Japan. Very nice to be here. Thank you. I think just first to echo what Mireya said, that I mean, the volume has come down in Washington in ways that we haven't seen since the start of the Trump administration. The lack of tweets, the kind of constant news stories 24 hours a day, the lashing out at allies and friends on Twitter. That's all, for the time being, that's disappeared. So it's a totally different world in that sense. But you're right, when it comes to China, the Biden administration so far, and its early days, has made clear that they're not going to, what some critics feared, that Biden might revert to the early days of the Obama administration when there was more of a reluctance to take a more assertive approach towards China. I think in the first, what are we now, kind of 6 weeks of the administration, it's clear that Biden, at least rhetorically, and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and others, have made clear that they will be tough on human rights and democracy, that they're not going to rush to do any kind of negotiations with China on anything for the time being, with potentially the exception of climate change. And as Mireya said, they're taking stock of where America is in the world. They are trying to rebuild alliances that were clearly damaged under Donald Trump. I went to Japan a few times with Trump, and also with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the defense secretary. And every time it was just watching Tokyo launch into panic mode, because you didn't know what Trump was going to say when he was there, or what he would tweet when his generals were there. So that was always fun. But on China, it's clear that it's not going to be calm waters. Already it's choppy. Joe Biden has said he's going to raise concerns about Taiwan, where the Chinese are increasingly active, on the clampdown on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, which is only getting worse, and on the situation in Xinjiang, where you have more than 1 million Uyghurs who are being persecuted in labor camps, or what the Chinese ambassador in Washington says are campuses, which no one takes seriously. On the other hand, the Chinese have said the dismal state of US-China relations is all down to Donald Trump. It was all his fault. China didn't do anything wrong. We hope things will get better under Joe Biden, but please don't cross our red lines, which are Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. So I think we're in for a pretty rocky time over the next 4 years. It's not going to be the same as the start of the Obama administration. And I know in Tokyo, there were concerns that Biden may be weaker on China than some would like. I don't think at the moment what we've seen suggests that's going to be the case. But as Mireya-san said, it's early days. Biden hasn't had to take any tough decisions yet, with the exception of the military strike in Syria. So we just have to watch and see. But I think he's going to be tougher than people expected.
Great, thank you. Toshi-san, let's come to you in Tokyo, picking right up where Dimitri left off. What's the view from Tokyo on what you're watching? Are you able to focus on what's happening in Washington, given all the news in Japan these days? You've got the Olympics coming. What's the concern in terms of U.S.-Japan relations, and how do you assess the Biden administration from where you're sitting?
Well, nowadays, we're the ones who's providing you with the scandals, right? So that's a big change. And I was looking back at my calendar, and the last time we did this was on October 20th, right before the election. So a lot has happened since, of course, there was the election, the chaos, and the allegation of fraud election, after the election. And then, of course, the January 6th, so the US image was badly, I think, damaged during this, months after the election. That's for sure. But you had this totally average inauguration. In a way, it was, unexciting, boring in a way, right? Not entertaining compared to the past 4 years. But I guess that's a good thing. Right? So I think here in Tokyo, the sense that Washington have returned to normal is quite prevalent. So the news report about the US and US politics and all that has somewhat decreased. I think for the past 4 years, it was just too much. Right? But last weekend, the CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, held their annual meeting in Florida. And that was pretty heavily covered by the Japanese media, and especially Mr. Trump's speech. And the commentators on TV were sort of speculating whether he would run again in 2024 and all that. And seeing all that, I realized that we were also complicit in the rise of Trump phenomena. Of course, CNN and all that. And the fact that they started covering the Trump campaign back in 2015 and 16, that was the trigger sort of event. But we were complicit as well, right? And in a way, we still are, because you don't actually get to see CPAC meetings on news in Japan, right? But you did, so that was kind of strange thing. Hopes for President Biden is not all that high. I would say there's a modest, healthy expectation, but I would say that many here understand that he would have to sort of clean up the mess of the past 4 years. So despite the message of, America's back, and he's been sending that constantly, right? In the sort of the Munich Security Conference speech, and even when he was addressing the State Department, he was trying to send the message that America is back, but we realized that there are big or huge constraints. So we're relieved, but at the same time, the expectation toward the Biden foreign policy and Biden team is not all that high. So that's how I would portray it.
Okay, so let's pick up right there, Midia-san, and where you left off, saying that it's too early to make grand pronouncement about what Biden's strategy is and what it is as he's still trying to get his cabinet even approved. What do you expect let's take two timeframes. In his first 100 days, what's the best that we can look for in terms of the Biden administration? What are they accomplishing? And then what does that mean in terms of looking at his broader term in terms of priorities? And are there areas that you would say, hey, for Japan, this is a big deal for the Biden administration over the next over the 100 days. So meaning he's almost halfway to that point. 100 days is kind of in the U.S. presidency, what many people look to give the first report card. How would you assess what he can accomplish and what you think there might be room for common alignment with Japan moving forward, Midia-san?
Thank you, Josh. Let me just start with a broader reflection, because I do want to qualify something. We've been talking about calm waters, and that's when I was referring to the tone set by the Biden administration. But we are really at a moment of profound turmoil internationally, addressing the pandemic, great power competition. there's a reordering, if you will, of international affairs, but there's also a lot happening domestically. And Toshi already made reference to that with his discussion of CPAC. But I think that, if you were to ask me what are some of the priorities of the Biden administration foreign policy, I would say that it's always outside looking and inward looking. And, to the world, it's about reassuring everyone that America is back. And domestically, it's making the connection that foreign policy works for the middle class. And each of those tasks has its challenges. But in terms of boosting the credibility of the United States, it's going to take more than 100 days. Because I would say that what really ails the United States in terms of returning to leadership position is that the world has become used to our polarization, to our gridlock. But we face a much deeper challenge that has to do with the resilience of American democracy. So when we project to the world, there's always going to be this question as to whether we can really re-energize, boost, heal those wounds. I also think that when we're thinking about how can the US be effective in the region, there's going to be the question as to whether we are prepared to resource big ticket initiatives and have Congress pass landmark agreements. If you will, if those were some of the weaknesses of the so-called pivot to Asia policy that the Obama administration pursued, then we had these 4 years of unilateralism from the Trump administration. And how do we pick up those pieces? How do we build that credibility? I think that there are things that the United States can do that begin to send a signal to the world that we are going to be of consequence to the region. There are a number of sectoral agreements on digital, on supply chain that we can start with. But we also have to do the domestic homework. And something, Josh, that I have not seen discussed as much as I would like is how we're going to really build up that safety net that allows American workers to respond to economic change. And how are we going to then think about big initiative trade agreements that bring back the United States to the regional architecture. So I would start small with some confidence building measures. Don't bite on more than you can chew. Down the line, we must reassure the world that we can indeed find that consensus. And that's not a small order given all that ails us and the culture wars, quite frankly, that we're in the midst of.
Mm-hmm. Dimitri, America is back. How does that resonate on the global stage? You talked about China basically saying, okay, that's fine as long as you stay in your own area. Don't try to mess in our region. And they're kind of very clearly drawing some red lines you described. How do you think more broadly about what the Biden administration inherits in 2020 versus 2008, which was the last experience that many of the people that are back in Washington and back with the Biden administration, they come from the Obama administration. How do you think about the world that they've inherited in 2021 and what they have to accomplish, not just in the 100 days, but the next 3.5 years that they have in front of them?
Well, I think there's a couple of big similarities, and then there are some very significant differences. So if you think back to 2008 or 2009, when Barack Obama came into office, he also inherited a huge economic crisis, not sparked by a health crisis, but a financial crisis nonetheless, which he had to deal with and Joe Biden had to deal with. And then also, I think people forget that back then, around the world, there was a lot of animosity towards the US, concern about the approach the Bush administration had taken in Iraq. And that feels like an awful long time ago now, but at that time, Obama and Biden had to deal with that as well. And there was a kind of a feeling around the world of, Bush, the warmonger, is gone, and now we have a president who's not going to take military action in the same way. And he'll be great for alliances. Well, there was a lot of appreciation for Obama in the beginning, but over time, there was concern that Obama wasn't as assertive overseas as maybe some would have liked. And I think the case of China and how Japan viewed the Obama administration's approach to China is one example of that. I think there's another kind of interesting thing that's happening, which is that, so Biden is president, he says America's back. I think a lot of people are breathing a sigh of relief just because whether they like Trump or dislike Trump or his policies, things are going to be more stable and less volatile. So in that sense, America is back. It will be easier to work out what America is doing. And I'll give you kind of a small anecdotal example from the perspective of someone who, spends his days interviewing officials. During the during the Trump administration, we had very good access to senior officials and to cabinet members, many of whom used to read the FT because they were in the business world. But we realized very early on that the information they had was not really very valuable because they didn't know what Donald Trump was going to do the next day. So we might have thought we were getting something fantastic, but we couldn't take it to the bank. I think in the Biden administration, there isn't going to be as much a kind of noise coming out, but when you get information from senior officials, there will be differences, and people will try and spin their counterparts in other countries, but generally the information will be more valuable and will give you a sense of where President Biden is going. So I think that's kind of important. It'll be easier to deal with Washington. The question is whether you will like the policy outcomes or not. And there are already signs of examples of where things are not going to be as smooth internationally as people might have hoped. So if you look at the EU and China and the US, the EU and China signed an investment treaty after Biden was elected, before he was inaugurated, despite the fact that Jake Sullivan had tweeted gently that the US would like Europe to hold off. So that's an example where interests are not going to be aligned. And so while I think it's going to be a lot more friendlier interaction, a lot more polite and less kind of vitriol, I don't think the underlying issues get any easier just because Biden is president. The US will still put pressure on its allies to spend more on defense and collective defense. That's not going to change. And then just kind of circling back a little bit to what Mireya was saying, I covered the 2016 presidential campaign and then remotely after March, the 2020 campaign. And I think the one thing that hasn't changed is Washington is calmer, yes, but the country is still incredibly divided. Donald Trump got 74 million votes, more than any Republican candidate has ever gotten in history. And when you go to places like Ohio or the Midwest or the Rust Belt, the concerns that propelled Donald Trump to power in 2016 have not dissipated, and in some places they've gotten worse, and they've been exacerbated by the pandemic and the economic crisis. So I think the difficulty for Biden is he's going to have to make America stronger to be able to say that America is back with any conviction. Right now, it's just rhetoric, but anyone who watched the January 6th insurrection and everything that happened after the election on November 3rd, knows that things are not smooth here. And as Mireya said, it may look calm on the surface, but it's not under the waters. And just one final example of that is, Biden has been talking about Buy America in terms of trade. And that's something that he has to do because the mood on trade in America has shifted dramatically. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but people here are already thinking about the 2022 midterm elections. And we have a 50-50 Senate. We have the Democrats have a smaller majority in the House than they had last year. And I think there's a lot of concern that it's actually, things could flip very easily. And the final point I would just say, I think that the lesson of the last 4 years for the world is that an American president can say or do one thing, but the next president can come in and on foreign policy overturn most things that haven't, been put into law by Congress. And so it's very hard to know, is the America of Joe Biden going to be the America from 2024? Is Donald Trump going to come back? If not, is someone like Donald Trump going to come back? So I think the problem dealing with America now is just, it's hard to know what to believe and where you can put your faith. And that's a big problem.
Toshi-san, this is a big problem, and you already put your finger on the role. Complicity is the word you use to describe Japan in the media. I mean, what we're hearing is a split screen. A Washington that is more competent, Mireya-san says, and Dimitri talks about the individuals who are, you can get credible information. They know what the president's thinking because he believes in process. He's a creature of Washington. He's worked in the space for almost 5 decades. what does this mean concretely for Japan as you deal with that split screen of the America's back, and then the reality of the divided America, and the fact that you're covering CPAC as opposed to some of the nuances of what a 50-50 Senate and what the midterms could mean, and what the red and blue state America that are not becoming one United States of America, as Barack Obama famously talked about, but almost two separate countries. How does Japan deal with that, and how do you think about even talking about the priorities of foreign policy when there's just so much domestically that Tokyo has to deal with in its relations with the United States, not just at the government level, but with people's businesses and societies?
Sorry, my microphone was off.
Yeah.
Well, it's tough, right? And as Dimitri just mentioned, we don't know what's going to happen after 2024, right? Because clearly the Trump phenomena was a structural thing. And if you see what's going on within the Republican Party, I mean, there's a high possibility that they would choose, again, a Trumpian candidate, right? And maybe even Mr. Trump himself. Right? So, but what can Japan and other sort of allies to the US do? I mean, not much, because it's an American process. It's an American people's choice. So what Japan did for the past 4 years was to adapt to whomever America chose collectively. And that was Mr. Trump. So, some people may criticize, make fun of what Japan did, in the past 4 years. But I mean, that was Japan's realism, I would say. And yes, as I said at the outset, we are sort of relieved right now because normalcy seems to be, the rule in Washington today. But how sustainable is that? We're not sure. So our sort of thinking is that there's no other options but to adapt, right? And in thinking about what Mr. Biden and his team is facing, I think the task is clear for the first 100 days and for the first year. It's COVID, right? I mean, he has to sort of somehow manage that situation. And that's not just only Mr. Biden. Prime Minister Suga is facing that kind of issue as well. So, I mean, the task for his first year would be managing the COVID-19 situation. And he's not going to cure the deep fissures and the divide US is facing, right? I mean, I may be too blunt about it, but he's not a Lincoln-esque president. Right? We all know that. He's not going to cure the structural disorder that US is facing. And I think that is expecting too much from him. So he would have to come out with a somewhat sort of pragmatic solution, and hopefully with a sort of a bipartisan spirit sort of added to that pragmatic solution, and not too bold, but bold enough solution and convince the American public that politics is about doing something together rather than just destroying your enemies. I mean U.S. has to sort of go back to this basic point about what politics is all about. And in that respect, I would say that Mr. Biden may have the exactly right temperament, right? So I think you can even make an argument that he was the best choice that U.S. had, and that U.S. collectively made the right decision in choosing Mr. Biden. But then again, I said at the outset of my sort of second remarks, we're not sure how sustainable that is. So we see the current direction that U.S. is going is good for the world, good for Japan, U.S.-Japan relations, and good for the U.S. But how sustainable is that? I think we have huge doubts about it.
So, Midia-san, let's go right down this discussion of trade, because it's already been raised at least a few times now. it seems that in a global pandemic, there's this real tension between the openness of the economy and public health concerns. And that's playing out in every country around the world. Now, when you add the layer of international economics and the supply chain and trade agreements, Dimitri already mentioned the EU and China trade deal. What does this mean for the United States that has this pressure, domestic pressure, that trade is now kind of a taboo word, and you have to have more nationalistic policies like Buy America, even if you're pro-trade here? What does that mean for the future of the U.S. as kind of the leader in the free market? What does that mean in terms of U.S. Japan relations, where you have the first and the third largest economies that have traditionally been the leaders in that space? Is there a new trade agenda that's kind of brewing that you say maybe this crisis could lead to something better, or is it more about just muddling through and trying to solve this domestic political question that we've been discussing?
Thank you. Where to start? I think that as a trade expert, it's been really quite discouraging to watch developments over the past few years. Certainly when the United States stepped out of the original TPP, I thought that was a strategic goal. And we are now in a position of just looking from the outside in, especially as the region has moved on without us. And now you have two mega trade agreements, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, but also the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement among 15 countries in the region. But I use the word shocked, Josh, quite deliberately, because with COVID, I think that these wearing down, erosion of cooperation really came to the surface in a very, very ugly way, in ways that we're still watching. And I think that I'm sad to report, I guess it is not news, but it does seem to be an era characterized more and more by economic nationalism. And what we're seeing is states, use the argument of national security, in some instances correctly, in some instances abusing it to restrict, to try to shape the flow of economic relations, trade and investment flows. But with the pandemic in particular, what we saw last year was what we refer to as export protectionism, that countries were hoarding or trying to grab on to supplies of personal protective equipment. There's concern that that may happen now with vaccines. And we know that it's a self-defeating set of measures. That the moment you try to restrict this, you are creating this incentive for producers to go up to scale. And we also know that as long as the virus flows freely in some regions of the world, it's going to come back and affect all of us. So we're all in this together, but we're nevertheless trying to resort to these national barriers and these more jingoistic sentiments. And quite frankly, with the export protectionism, what we also saw was a little, quite frankly, in many ways a disregard of the WTO, because many countries did not even bother to notify that they were undertaking these measures. So I'm hoping that there have been some lessons learned and that we understand that supply chains are actually part of the solution, that they are important in making sure that we have access to these medical supplies and these personal protective equipment. What to do, and when the pandemic eases, because I am still an optimist and I believe that there will be a moment in time when we get past this very difficult moment, the great power competition is not abating. And there's going to be a very fundamental reorientation. And I would be very interested in hearing, Dimitri, I know you follow very closely U.S.-China tech competition, but there's some major steps being taken then that are going to be very hard to unwind. So, we saw during the Trump years, the misuse of the national security, imposing the so-called 232 tariffs on our allies. I did not see any discussion from the Biden team on any early move to eliminate those tariffs. So the tariff has gained terrain in our mindset, in our policy actions, and it doesn't seem that we're willing to let it go. But also with the more expanding definition of export controls to cover foundational and emerging technologies, I think that those concerns are very real and something needs to be done, but there's very clearly the risk of overreach. So again, where is the boundary between healthy, robust economic exchange, and guarding against vulnerabilities and risks. Those are conversations that have become much more poignant. And to be quite frank, we need to discuss whether we can coordinate effectively with our allies or not, because we might agree on the end goals and have disagreements on process, on tactics, and different perceptions of threat and vulnerability. And that conversation is just getting started.
Dimitri, let's just pick up right where Miria left off in terms of just listening to all of that. It is depressing, as she said, in terms of we're in a very different place than we were 5 years ago. And even the architects of TPP and TTIP and these other grand trade deals that many in the Obama administration, including Joe Biden himself and many of the team players now that are now making up the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, now have realized the political sensitivities. What does this mean for the future of kind of the U.S., but just also the economic and Miria talked about this World War II order that seems to be under shift right now with COVID, that it's changed and it's been accelerator. How do you think about this from the business context that you cover both in the U.S.-China perspective, but also that the Financial Times is focused on?
Well, just an interesting side note. I was listening to a podcast that last night that Mireya did with Mike Green. One of the points made was that many of the Biden administration officials actually do believe in free and fair trade and deep down do support the TPP. But the political landscape has changed so much in America that they can't say that publicly. And they know that it's just not realistic to think about, for example, in the near term, the US trying to get back into the TPP 2.0. In terms of the broader issues, I mean, I think, and this is piggybacking again a little bit on what Maria said, that I think the tech competition is going to be the dominant story of the next few years. Because, you know, what became clear during the Trump administration was Donald Trump, you know, talked a lot about decoupling supply chains, technology supply chains. A lot of the things that his administration did were geared towards doing that. But I think it's often forgotten that, and it's hard to say which came first and which came after, that China is also trying to decouple from the US, but in a different way. China wants to suck in as much US technology and you know, a know-how beforehand. But ultimately, I think the direction we're going in at the moment, unless we see some kind of substantial improvement in US-China relations, and even that might not be enough, is two parallel and separate technological universes where the US and like-minded allies and partners are going one direction. You know, China goes in a different direction with countries that align more with it, and a bunch of countries find themselves caught in the middle. You know, just yesterday, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence warned that China was in danger of overtaking the US when it comes to AI, that the US is so reliant on Taiwan for semiconductors, which power everything from my iPhone to precision-guided missiles, that if China invaded Taiwan, what would that mean for, you know, every electrical appliance on the planet? So I think what we're going to see is an effort by the Biden administration, which they've already started, to look at global supply chains. How can the US be less reliant on China? China, on the other hand, is going to do as much as it can to make sure in the future that it's not reliant on the US, particularly for semiconductors. But both of those things are incredibly difficult to do. I spent a year of my life at one point touring factories in South China, looking at supply chains, going into the factories, looking at how clusters of companies and manufacturers, you know, work together in small areas. And, you know, you have to see it in China to believe it. There's so much concentrated there that the idea that the US can just decouple from China totally is not, it's just ridiculous, certainly in the short term. And you would need 10 or 20 years to replicate what you have in South China on a kind of a more global basis. But the US clearly needs to think more about that because of the way China, the direction China is going in. So I think one of the themes of the next 4 years is really going to be how do you make American supply chains more resilient, less reliant on China? How do you diversify? And how does America, with its allies like Japan and some European countries, what do they do to try and counter what China is doing in terms of protecting their own supply chains? And it's complicated because Japan, as everyone listening here knows, has huge business interests in China. Even though it has moved more stuff to Vietnam and other places, it's still critical for Japanese supply chains, and as is Taiwan. So, but I think that's going to be a very difficult subject. It's very technical. It's hard to write about from a personal point of view, but it's going to be, I think, the issue that in some ways dominates a part of the geopolitical story for the next while.
So, Toshi-san, thinking about this from the Japanese perspective, obviously economics and trade is kind of the lifeblood of Japan, where this is what's defined the U.S.-Japan relationship for at least the last 50 years. What does this mean for Japan as it begins to look out over the next 50 years? I mean, I'm reminded that 50 years ago is kind of around the time that the U.S. and China kind of came back together, the Great China Opening that left Japan incredibly scared at that period of time of what this meant. We're going through another global reordering, as we've talked about. How is Japan looking at this? I know what they say officially in terms of, the strongest security ally on the one side, the largest market on the other, and Japan's caught right in the middle between the U.S. and China. What does this mean when you think about the world and kind of Japan's own foreign policy in relation to U.S.-Japan relations?
Well, as Josh, as you correctly mentioned, this global sort of revitalizing global sort of trade order is the lifeblood and the lifeline of Japan, because Japan is sort of destined to be a trading country, right? So if you look at what's going on in the United States, sort of adding to the gloomy picture that Mireya sort of explained to us, when U.S. was engaging in a sort of a trade agreement, a mega trade agreement or trade agreement, you could sort of expect most of the Republicans to support it, right? So if you're a Democratic president, you would convince a sort of a small moderate wing of a sort of Democratic sort of group, and then add that together with the Republicans, and then you would have the majority, right? That was how it was done. But now what you're seeing is that the skepticism within the Republican Party that is closely related to Mr. President Trump's America First agenda, that this America sort of trying to uphold this global trade regime, enhancing free trade, what good is it for ordinary American people? I mean, Mr. Trump said it in a very blunt way, but his message resonated among the Republican grassroots. So I think it has become very difficult for Republican politicians to sort of wholeheartedly support a free trade agreement. And you always had some skepticism about these free trade agreement on the Democratic side. So it's almost impossible now, politically impossible now, to somehow form a majority coalition supporting free trade. And that is very worrisome for Japan. So there was this article on Foreign Affairs just recently saying that, Japan is the new leader of Asia's liberal order, right? I think that's going a bit too much, but that's what we felt we needed to do for the last 4 years. But that was premised on the condition that U.S. would somehow return, right? But we're finding out that U.S. may not return. So when Mr. Biden was aiming for presidency, he said that he would sort of emphasize multilateral sort of institutions, multilateral agreements. Among them, he said, he would return to WHO, Paris Accord, JCPOA, and TPP, right? But although TPP is in that list, I don't think there's any effort for the U.S. to rejoining TPP at the moment. And I don't think politically you can't really expect that. So I think Japan would try to, as we did with the CPTPP, that we would try to sort of uphold a liberal trade order in our region. But how sustainable that our effort would be without the U.S., It's going to be a very difficult, task for Japan to pursue. Josh, we can't hear you.
Sorry, if you're not on mute in 2021, you're not doing a real call and it's not live. So thank you for letting me know. Midia-san, let's pick up right where he left off. I mean, you have a lot of thoughts and you've written literally the book on trade. What advice do you have for us as we go? I mean, we've been using the method, the idea of calm waters maybe in Washington, choppy waters in the world. Trade used to be something that would help countries become closer and create interdependency, but now trade is becoming weaponized in different ways. Like, what does this mean for the future of the international economic system? And then where does that leave the US and Japan, both with leaders that we currently have, Prime Minister Suga in Japan, President Biden in the US, in terms of their domestic politics, but more broadly, their global agenda that in some ways is based upon having a trading system that helps their national champions in the different markets they're dealing with?
Thank you, Josh. So I don't become the gloomy person in this conversation. Let me tell you that there's lots that can be done. And I think that the United States can, in a painful, tortured way, make it back. It's not going to be easy, it's not guaranteed, but it's not impossible. That's the main message I want to give. I think that we could start, as I said before, with some pragmatic agreements, say the digital economy, which is critical. It's now the engine of so many of these economies. The United States already has digital agreements, one with Japan, that could become a model for a plurilateral agreement, and one where I don't think that the politics are deadly. I think that there's a fighting chance for an agreement of that nature to make it through even the fractured politics of today. If you look at the hearing for the USTR nominee, Catherine Tsai, you could also hear some people in Congress asking, when are we going to talk about opening markets? So there is that, I don't know if the word is impetus, but there is that concern that we have focused a lot on enforcement, on defensive measures, that there's reason for that, but it must be balanced with the opening markets element of trade policy. I also think it's very important that for us to be credible, we don't start with a pie in the sky initiative of let's eventually down the road talk about a new, very ambitious multilateral trade negotiation, because we don't have credibility for that. We don't have the years to get that negotiated and ratified before we're talking about the next presidential election. And again, who knows who's coming next and with what approach. But there's something that can be done in the medium term, and that is a return to the CPTPP in an accession negotiation. And I think there's far more credibility to do that because the CPTPP is very much a creature of the United States, and there's still some very important rules and disciplines that have traction within this country. And what you need to do is to look at what kind of trade agreements recently gathered bipartisan support. And that is the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And I think that has to be the formula. And the good elements of the USMCA were the modernization that took place by incorporating TPP-like disciplines. But also, very importantly, what the USMCA did is that it reconciled the Democratic Party with modern trade agreements. And yeah, there are now tighter disciplines on labor standards and the environment. And I think that if the United States were to approach countries and say, let's talk about focused, targeted renegotiation of those standards as our way back into the CPTPP, I hope that countries in the region are willing to be flexible. Now, this requires, of course, a careful maneuvering. I would just say that an accession negotiation in many ways takes out the risk for existing CPTPP countries, because if at the end of the day, American politics disappoint and the United States cannot ratify the agreement, the CPTPP is not harmed because the US just didn't make it back. It continues. It would not be great, but it's not a lethal wound. So I think that that's a place to start. But I also know that the mantra of the CPTPP for new members, prospective members, is that the agreement is as is. You must take it as it is. And I think that's the right message, especially when China is beginning to send signals of interest, because you don't want China to water down the disciplines. So to me, that's the standard. Would you be willing to negotiate to improve the agreement or to make it possible for security guarantor, stabilizing presence in the region like the United States to come back? Then I would say be pragmatic. To try to bring China in a way in which it basically erodes what the CPTPP stands for, I wouldn't support that, and I don't think there is support within the existing membership. So my basic message, Josh, is that it's not all lost. Trade politics are always very creative, but there's limited time too, because the region has moved on, because China is blunting the narrative of decoupling with negotiations with the Europeans, with the regional comprehensive economic partnership, and quite simply by growing in the midst of this recession and containing COVID. So there's no time to lose, but something can be done indeed.
Switching from just the economics and trade to the security side, these are the two big things we talk a lot about in the international environment, and particularly in terms of U.S. Japan. But there seems to be, we talk a lot about decoupling in terms of U.S. and China. There seems to be a lot of coupling in terms of economic security, whether it's the new National Security Council that's relatively new in Japan and the focus on economic security, the idea that you can't separate these two things, that the trade agenda and kind of the domestic well-being of our economies is directly connected to having free and fair competition laws, and the Chinese use of national champions and the geotechnology competition playing out between Silicon Valley and Beijing right now puts Japan at a very precarious position, because it in some ways is stuck as a bystander. What does this mean from your perspective in terms of how you think the U.S.-Japan alliance will be kind of evolving in this geopolitical choppy water? And given your experience in Japan as well, if you were thinking about this from a Japanese point of view, how would you think about this competition that's coming down between the U.S. and China, and with Japan's place in it?
Let me just quickly, before I jump into it, if I just can say one thing on CPTPP, because I'm going to switch the tables. So I'm going to be the gloomy one here, Mireya. I think just look at the one big trade deal that Trump did was the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA. And I remember speaking to someone in Eastern Ohio, a very manufacturing focused area, who said to me that NAFTA was more unpopular in Ohio than Osama bin Laden. It was that bad. So how did Trump convince people to sign up to USMCA? The one thing that Trump was really good at is a salesman. Everything in his career, from The Apprentice to everything else, was about selling. It wasn't about making. And he sold that deal to Congress and got it through. I think the problem with CPTPP is ahead of the 2022 midterms and the 2024 presidential election, Trump, whether he runs himself or not, would use any talk about the Americans getting into CPTPP as a way to both hammer Democrats, to hammer Joe Biden, and to hammer any more moderate Republican who might be, deep down want to do it, but a little bit nervous. So I think that the politics of that will only get more toxic. And you could say that it's inconsistent, but if Donald Trump showed one thing over the last 4 years, it was that its inconsistency rules. So I don't think there's a chance in hell that the US will join CPTPP in the next 2 years. And I don't have a hat, but if I had a hat, I would eat it if they joined within the next 4 years. On Japan being a bystander between the kind of the geopolitical competition with the US and China, I mean, I think it's a kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Prime Minister Abe, when he was in power, clearly wanted the US to be tough on China. He may not have liked the way Donald Trump did things sometimes, the volatility, some of the language may have been counterproductive. But I think overall, he was glad, or the Japanese administration was glad that the US was being tough on China in most respects. I think that isn't going to change, although it's not. I'd love to hear what Toshi thinks, but it strikes me that Suga-san is not as outwardly focused as Abe was. I mean, you don't hear an awful lot about Japan in the world, at least I don't from Washington. Maybe that's because he's less of an effusive personality than Abe was. But I think the tricky thing for Japan is going to be balancing the security and the economics. As I said a couple of minutes ago, you only have to tour economic zones in China to see how much Japanese investment and Japanese companies and manufacturing are there. So how does Japan maintain its kind of security alliance with the US in terms of being tough on China, doing more in the South China Sea, reinvigorating the Quad with India and Australia, all things that China doesn't like, with the reality that Japan, needs China, both in terms of an economic market as its own population shrinks, and also as a source of manufacturing and, again, supply chains that cannot be moved in the short term. So I think that's going to be very, very difficult. And I think probably Toshi is more qualified to opine on that than me. But I do think it's a big challenge. And I know that, one of the things Kurt Campbell in the White House is doing at the moment is talking to the allies in Europe and in Asia to try and look at what they can do together on the technology front and supply chain front.
All right, Toshi-san, I think Dimitri's already served you right up. Let me just add to what he listed, which is kind of Japan's global role. We got very used to seeing Prime Minister Abe having such a long tenure, and very unusual among Japanese politics, to be a global statesman. He had good relations with Donald Trump that surprised everyone because he was able to manage him better than almost anyone else. But he also had good relations with Putin and Erdogan and pretty much every leader around the world that felt. Prime Minister Suga doesn't have the opportunity, number one, because of this pandemic, to travel and meet them, but he also doesn't seem to have the disposition or the soaring rhetoric or the same desire. His first trip, which was very limited to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, the words that he said seem to be a continuation of the Abe policy, but it seems that given some of the constraints and the scandals ongoing in Japan, and even larger concern about COVID and about hosting the Olympics, what does this mean for Japan's global role, and what does that mean for U.S.-Japan relations? Does that mean that we're entering a period of kind of calm plateau where we just kind of the status quo is normal, or is there actually something bubbling under the surface in Tokyo that we're not seeing here?
Right. I don't really have a clear-cut answer for that, but I think, we tend to tie a certain policy towards a certain politician, certain personal character. And yes, Prime Minister Abe, really loved to play the role of a chief diplomat, right? Foreign policy was his favorite sort of policy area. Whereas Prime Minister Suga, I don't think it's not that he's uninterested, but compared to Prime Minister Abe, yes, his presence in sort of world affairs, international relations, is a bit dim, right? There's no doubt about it. But the reason why Prime Minister Abe sort of took a new route for Japan's foreign policy is, I think, based on a structural reason, I think. Right? I think there's a sense in Japan, and this is very different from the Cold War days, right, that this concerning this global and long-term competition with China, Japan is at the forefront. I think there's a widespread sense about that. So yes, there's a split between the business community and the foreign policy and the national security crowd. But I would say basically people here do understand that we have to somehow manage and try to sort of accept this premise that we are in a long competition with China. So yes, Prime Minister Abe seems to be a bit reluctant in showing Japan's proactive role, but basically, I think that's I think there's a basic continuation from Prime Minister Abe, in that Japan has to do more in terms of maintaining the alliance with the United States and trying to uphold a liberal sort of order in our part of the world. So, but can we do that alone is always the question we ask ourselves, right? Trying to not counter, but somehow manage China's uncertain rise. We're not sure which way China is going, but more and more we're seeing its sort of hegemonic ambitions behind it. And can we manage that situation alone? And the answer is no, right? So who is the best realistic partner that we have? It's still the United States, by far. So that's why we keep on asking the question, what is Biden's China policy? Is it tough enough? Will it return to, the beginning of the Obama administration? And I know that the American people see Japan and say that, you're sort of over speculating about things. The fact that the Biden team is consisted of, former Obama team doesn't necessarily mean that it's Obama 2.0. But as we try to understand what sort of Biden team's China policy, I think they have shifted from trying to balance between sort of the engagement and hedging, right? I mean, that was the standard. And on the Democratic side, they tended to sort of put more emphasis on the engagement side. But this balancing of engagement and hedging, I think that's no longer the theory. I think there's a wide acceptance even within the Democratic Party that this competition is going to be a tough competition and a long competition. And I think the Biden team has successfully sort of convinced us that we don't have to worry too much about it. But at the same time, I think the intention behind Biden's China policy is not to sort of intensify the competition, but to try to somehow control and manage the competition. And where that would lead us, we're not sure. I'm not saying that Mr. Trump's, sort of putting fire on the competition was good for Japan, but at least the message that was being sent to the region and to China was unambiguous, right? It was clear that U.S. is going to engage in a tough competition and we're not going to back down, right? And maybe that would sometimes put Japan and some countries in the region in a difficult position, but at least it was unambiguous. But we see sort of Mr. Biden's sort of China policy slowly emerging. We don't know. I think it's going to take time to actually being sort of formulated. But as we see it, I think the emphasis is on somehow taming and controlling the competition rather than pressuring China. Of course, it depends on the issue. If you're talking about human rights and other issues, maybe Biden team is going to be tougher. But generally speaking, I think we're, a bit nervous about it. But at the moment, I think the Biden team has sort of successfully convinced us that we don't have to worry too much about their China policy.
I'm getting all sorts of questions here. You guys have answered a lot of them. A lot of questions focus on TPP, but there are some questions that have not been answered. So I want to make sure I give our audience an opportunity to answer questions. If you want to put those questions there in the YouTube or the channel you're watching on, please go ahead and do that. We will collect those. But I've also got a series of questions here. So let me just do kind of a rapid fire set of questions. But let me start with Media. I mean, one of the ones that came through was, what do you think is one important issue in U.S.-Japan relations that you believe is not getting the attention it deserves, that you think we should be focusing more on? If you had to say the one issue, what would that be for you, Media-san? And you're on mute, so you have to come off so we can hear you.
I'm glad you cut that. Thank you. Well, one issue, I mean, I think that there has to be a shared economic agenda. I think that we should go past the bilateral frame. Some people have asked me if I think that it would be good for the U.S. to negotiate a second stage to the trade deal. I think that actually is like looking at your belly button. I mean, it's not enough. The conversation should be about what can we do together. And as Dimitri and I were discussing, the politics are hard, but there's something that can be done in digital economy, in a supply chain, and something that that's my suggestion to that question, Josh, infrastructure investment. This is an administration that believes in the power of government spending, infrastructure building. And we know that there's a lot to do in the region, that Japan has been very active, that there have been efforts, some trilateral initiatives, but they have remained largely untapped and unused. So I think that scaling up those initiatives would be important. And then also, coming from out of the pandemic, efforts to think through about, I'm really concerned about this global economic downturn, debt crisis issues. Again, this is something that we should not lose sight of and be proactive. And now that the United States have become a much more constructive actor in G7, G20, and IMF and so forth, I think that there's more potential to do that. And finally, reconstructing these exchanges that were curtailed because of the pandemic, the people-to-people exchanges. I think that would be an important priority in how we come back to that post-pandemic world.
Okay, great. Dimitri, there's a question here about North Korea policy. We haven't talked much about it. How do you think the U.S. North Korea policy is going to change in the Biden administration? I think that Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State who's been nominated, has talked about kind of bringing the six-party talks back. How does that also impact in terms of U.S.-Japan relations in the context of this regional architecture that the six-party talks used to be, but we haven't heard much about since the meeting between President Trump and the dear leader?
I think actually on North Korea, and a lot of people laugh when I say this, but I think Trump probably deserves a little bit more credit than he got. If you think about it, 4 years ago, or 3.5 years ago, we were talking about fire and fury and destroying Pyongyang. And since then, it's been relatively calm. Right now, you don't really have missiles flying over Japan. Tensions have been lowered. And critics will say, well, during that time, Kim Jong-un has still continued with his nuclear development, his nuclear weapons development. And that's true, but he did that during the Obama administration. He did that during the Bush administration. That's been consistent. But I think probably for people in the region, that lower tensions for the time being is not a bad thing. The question is, how do you get from there to actually denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula? Personally, I think six-party talks, I don't see how that works in a world where U.S.-China relations are where they are right now. I mean, how are the U.S. and China going to work together on North Korea in any kind of a speedy way to solve this problem? I just don't see it. I think the one thing that Trump and Kim showed, that even though there was no progress towards actual denuclearization occurred, I think it's hard to see people below Kim negotiating with people in the Biden team in a way that leads to a deal. I think clearly on the Korean side, the imprimatur of the leader is very, very important. And maybe that's one of the things that Trump actually picked up on. So I find it very hard to see a path forward on North Korea. People in Washington will sometimes say Korea is not a nuclear power. Well, I'm sorry, but that's ridiculous. Korea is already a nuclear power, whether you call it that or not. It has nuclear weapons, therefore it's a nuclear power. The only question is, how far can it deliver them? So I would be pretty pessimistic. I don't think Joe Biden and Kim Jong-un will meet. And even if they did meet, I don't think you're going to have the kind of bonhomie that Trump and Kim had. So I don't see an easy path forward on that. I suspect what we'll see is a return to what was happening at the end of the Obama administration, which was being led by Tony Blinken as Deputy Secretary back then, which is a campaign of maximum pressure, sanctions. I expect we'll see a stepping up of that towards getting the North Koreans back to some kind of a table. But the problem with North Koreans is, when you can get them back to the table sometimes, but it doesn't seem to yield anything. So I'm very, I would be very gloomy about the prospects of that. And what does that mean for Japan? I think, it kind of means for Japan what it means for everyone else. But I think it also means that the idea that the US is going to focus on the abductees, which I know is always a big concern in Tokyo, is just not going to be a big concern. The truth is, it never has been for anyone outside of Japan, and I don't think it ever will be.
Are you guys still there? Sorry. This is what happens when you lose power in the middle of a live Zoom. We were joking about this, but it's actually happened. So I caught the last part of that, but I think you finished answering the question, Dimitri.
I was just saying how wonderful you are, Joshua, but you missed it all.
Oh, I know that's how it is. Well, I'm going to keep on pushing forward because we have more questions. Toshi-san, we have a question here that says, has it surprised you that we have not seen more Japan experts going into the Biden administration? What is his policy choices in terms of his selections thus far tell you? And as Tokyo concerned, especially as it comes to other cabinet picks besides the ambassador that we're still waiting for?
Right. Well, about the ambassador, the rumors floating around, former Chicago mayor, I'm a bit worrisome about that. I mean, it doesn't really, Mr. Emanuel is known to be a really tough negotiator, right? A blunt negotiator. And do you need to send that kind of person to Tokyo? And many of the issues between Washington and Tokyo is technical, right? And you don't need a blunt, tough negotiator to be sent to Tokyo. So I hope it's only a rumor. My favorite candidate would be Cindy McCain, but she seems to be going to UK as the rumor goes. I think Cindy McCain makes sense because it's a bipartisan message. Sending a female ambassador to Japan is a good message, right? But we'll see about the ambassadorship. Right? We have a new ambassador to DC, Ambassador Tomita, who's pretty good. He's a scholarly ambassador. He's written 2 books about UK Prime Minister Thatcher and Prime Minister Churchill. So that's something new for a Japanese ambassador. And about Mr. Biden's appointment, foreign policy appointments, initially we were a bit worried, right? Because you had Mr. Blinken, who did sort of manage the sort of North Korean sanctions, but in general, he was not seen as an Asia hand, more sort of versed into transatlantic relations, right? And he speaks French and all that, I guess. And you had Lloyd Austin, General Austin, for Secretary of Defense, who was more of a Middle East CENTCOM commander, right? So initially we were worried. But as we saw their sort of prepared speech during the confirmation in the Senate, the Foreign Relations Committee, they all sort of mentioned China. I think Mr. Blinken mentioned China as being a pacing competitor, right? That sort of implied that they're determined to engage in a long competition with China. So I mean that sort of sort of tamed our worries, and of course Kurt Campbell, Dr. Kurt Campbell, was appointed as the coordinator for Indo-Pacific, and we all know him. He's very much trusted, and U.S. Japan relations is not just about bilateral relations these days, right? It has regional and global implications. So we're not really worried that the so-called Japan hand, whether Japan hand is appointed or not. We're interested, in more of an issue expert, seeing Japan as playing an important role in the issue that he or she is responsible. So in that respect, we're not all that worried. And there's a rumor that Mr. Campbell is going to visit this region. Oh, Josh, you gone? Okay. Recently, in the near future. So I think we're pretty confident about the Mr. Biden's East Asia or Indo-Pacific policy team at the moment.
Great, thank you. So given that we're having technical difficulties and I'm out of power, I'm going to do the last round of questions, and hopefully you guys can drive this. Midya, let me ask you the question that was asked here. what do you think the biggest change in economic and trade relations will be for the Biden administration? Is the Biden administration likely to reverse the Trump era agricultural, steel or aluminum tariffs on Japanese goods? And if so, at which point do you think that's going to happen? 2021, 22, 23? What do you think?
There's going to be change and continuities. The bigger change, I think, is a constructive approach to multilateralism and the desire to coordinate with allies, and very importantly, to not be obsessed with bilateral trade deficits. That already puts us so much more ahead of the game. So that's all very welcome. But there are also going to be continuities. As I mentioned before, the tariffs on China are not going down anytime soon, and they might be used for leverage. And I'm hoping to see the structural reform agenda come back to that conversation between the United States and China, because the stage one U.S.-China trade agreement ended up being mostly about managed trade. But nevertheless, the tariffs on China will remain. The tariffs vis-a-vis the allies, as I mentioned before, in national security, it doesn't appear that they're going to go away anytime soon. And there's a question as to where that will undermine the coordinated approach with China. I also think there's going to be continuity on the export controls, on the FDI screening for national security, on the concern with cybersecurity, and the tough line with vis-a-vis China's telecom. But again, the hope is that this can be now done through a very carefully orchestrated interagency process, and that the views of allies can be incorporated, and hopefully that it results in some sort of rulemaking and coordinated effort. So I would say that we ditched the unilateralism, we ditched the trade deficit focus, but the tariffs are here to stay, and the export controls and all the national security measures are likely to endure.
Great, thank you. Dimitri, let me ask you the question. There's the perennial question about, do you think that now is the right time for troop withdrawal from Okinawa? That's a question that was thrown our way.
To be honest, I haven't heard anyone here kind of talk about that, so I'm not sure that it's at the forefront of the agenda. I think it would be an unusual time to push for that, given, again, the tensions with the US and China, also particularly given how increasingly assertive China is being both around the Senkaku and also around Taiwan. So I personally, I wouldn't expect that in the near future, but it's the kind of issue that can pop up from time to time, as you know.
Great. And since we've made it to the very end here, I have to ask Toshi-san a point of personal moderation privilege. We were talking earlier about the idea of JNON, something I'd never heard about before. And I want you to explain it, given that you started by talking about the culpability of Japan and the media and the coverage of CPAC. And I've heard from some of my friends that there have been impacts of the Trump presidency in the Japanese political life. So please educate us on what JNON is for those of us that are not familiar.
Right. It's just J Anon, right?
Anon,
you change the Q to J, and it's the Japanese believers of QAnon, but maybe not the QAnon conspiracy per se, but the fact that the election was fraud, that Mr. Trump is better for Japan. And I'm not saying that was a huge component of Japanese society or anything, but you clearly sense that they were there. And especially because I was on the media all the time talking about US elections and all that during the months of October, November, and December, I was like fiercely, constantly being attacked on social media. Whenever I mentioned President Biden or President-elect Biden, they would like fiercely attack me as saying that you're believing the fake news, the fake media or not. So it was really interesting. I think it was the first time that these kind of conspiracy theories sort of spread throughout the world through social media, right? Usually these conspiracy theories are regional, but because we're so connected that it happened almost simultaneously. as fierce as it was happening in the United States. But the one way interesting thing was that when Avril Haines was sort of, in the Senate confirmation hearing for Director for National Intelligence, there was an article on New York Times or Washington Post, or I forgot which, but it was mentioning that the intelligence communities are paying attention to how conspiracy theories, American conspiracy theories, are spreading abroad. And it specifically mentioned Japan and Germany, and not other countries. So, I started to think, why Japan? And one of the answers that I had was that, we don't have a populist national sort of movement, as in Germany or as in UK in the form of Brexit or in France. So we didn't really understand the dangers of Mr. Trump to democracy. We saw him as a, sorry for saying this, but a typical American, just being blunt and tough on China. Right? So that's why there's this strong pro-Trumpian element in Japan, because we don't understand the dangers of Mr. Trump. But, I was trying to sort of convince the Japanese public that, Mr. Trump is not a typical American, that he is a danger to the American democracy. And I don't know how successful I was in doing that. But, while I was doing that, I was being constantly being attacked by JN, and that made a very strong impression on me. And don't get it wrong. I'm not saying that they're a major force in Japan, but they're a small but loud minority. And I was very much disturbed by it.
Well, thank you for that. Let me just give everybody an opportunity to just say a last word. Let me go to Dimitri next. Maybe just a comment on Biden and Suga moving forward, and then I'll have Midya close with the last word. Dimitri?
Sure. I just think it's going to be interesting to watch the two leaders because, I've spent time on and off with Biden on the campaign trail and in other circumstances. I also had dinner with Suga-san a few years ago in Tokyo, and it strikes me that in some ways, they have the makings of a good relationship. They both come from very humble backgrounds. One of them likes to talk an awful lot, and it's hard to get him to stop talking. The other one, you have to persuade him to talk a little bit more, and I'll let the audience guess which is which. Both of them don't drink, which is an interesting point they have in common. But I also think that Suga-san is not going to be the big personality that Abe was, and Biden is not going to be the kind of personality that Trump was. So I think they'll have a stable and decent relationship, but I think ultimately, actually, you're going to see that relationships between ministers and cabinet secretaries and other staff in the bureaucracy is actually going to be more important under Biden and Suga than it was under Trump and Abe. So I think kind of big leader personality politics is going to slightly recede from the U.S. Japan equation.
Great, thank you. Midya-san, if you get the last word, the one thing I would ask you is the world is supposed to be coming to Tokyo this summer for the Olympics. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world more broadly with COVID. How do you think about Japan and also U.S. Japan relations as we lead into the summer when hopefully there's a season of hope that's coming from this horrible pandemic we've been enduring for just over a year now?
U.S. Japan relations are fine. They're robust, they're sound, they survived the turbulence of America First. And as Dimitri said, they're going to do well with these now more process-driven set of leaders. The Olympics do represent a major challenge for Japan. Something I wanted to add when Toshi was talking about Prime Minister Suga is that we should also, we've been focusing rightly so on the constraints that the US faces, but Japan also has some serious constraints. The Suga administration came into being in a moment of crisis, and fighting COVID is going to be the key priority. But also, Prime Minister Suga has big plans for Japan that we didn't have a chance to discuss much: the digitalization, the carbon neutral society. So the most generous prognostication would be that Prime Minister Suga can do what Prime Minister Abe could not and deliver on the third arrow. But nevertheless, he has had some real difficulties in keeping his level of public support. He does not come from a traditional faction. So the question is, can he really undertake this kind of across-the-board reforms that are going to generate a lot of pushback from many different groups when he's struggling in the polls? We know that Prime Minister Koizumi, which is the other figure that he's usually compared to, relied on that public support to confront the postal masters, where Prime Minister Suga has a much broader reform agenda, and it seems that he's struggling keeping the support of the people. And the response to COVID-19 and the handling of the Olympics are going to be critical, and this is a year of elections in Japan. So again, the U.S.-Japan relation goes beyond the specific electoral calendars or who is in charge, because it's a robust alliance. But nevertheless, we should also pay attention to a very interesting year ahead for Japan.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, given that it's both interesting, but also a sense of reassurance that the U.S.-Japan alliance is going to be both interesting, but critical for both countries as we move forward. I can't think of a better panel to have guided us through this. Thank you, Media Solis there in D.C., Dimitri there in D.C. as well, and then Toshi Nakayama in Tokyo. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, the audience, for joining us. I apologize for the unexpected outage, but it seems appropriate in the world that we live in. So thank you all for your time this morning and evening, and I hope you have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.